Hi everyone, this is Ricky Spencer, and welcome to the Sociology of Media Voices series. Today, we have someone who has achieved quite a lot in their lifetime. They are Stuart Kells. He is an award-winning author and historian. He has twice won the Ashurst Business Literature Prize and has been shortlisted for the Prime Minister's Literary Award, the New South Wales Premier's General History Prize, and the University of Queensland Non-Fiction Book Award. Stuart's work has appeared in the Paris Review, The Times, Lapham's Quarterly, Smithsonian, The Guardian, National Geographic Traveller, The Daily Beast, and many other publications. He is also the Adjunct Professor at La Trobe University's College of Arts, Social Sciences and Commerce. With Scott Hamilton, Stuart has written Sold Down the River, their next monthly through text publishing. This book exposes a series of disastrous policy decisions that have put Australia's main river systems in dire straits. Trading in water rights was intended to send water to where it would best be used. Instead, the water market has enriched external traders, damaged the environment, and sent water into perverse directions. To write Sold Down the River, Stuart and Scott interviewed irrigators, farmers, traditional custodians, and water traders from across the Murray-Darling Basin. Okay, Stuart. So after that fabulous bio intro, tell me the book Sold Down the River. What was the inspiration to get that particular publication up and running?
Thanks, Ricky, and it's great to be talking to you. Well, as you well know, water is so important, and it's important in all sorts of different spheres, and that's only becoming more so in a time of climate change and in a time of industrial change as well. It's always been an interest of mine, and I've been in and out of the water sector in different ways, as has my fellow author, Scott Hamilton. But this particular book really came out of some work we were doing a couple of years ago, where we were researching the politics of bipartisanship and when government works well and when it doesn't work well. As you know, the Murray-Darling Basin plan has really been a bit of a kind of case study in successful and unsuccessful bipartisanship. So we wrote a few pieces 2 or 3 years ago, including in the University of Melbourne's Pursuit magazine, around the Murray-Darling Basin Plan and Indigenous water rights and water trading and a few other things. And that really had a great response, particularly from people in the Murray-Darling Basin who were pretty concerned about the way that the water market had been heading. In all sorts of different ways, people were concerned. And so we looked at it pretty closely. We looked at the key documents. We read into the literature, a lot of the academic literature, but also the regulators' reports and other things, and other literatures as well. And we started talking to people in the basin. And it's it's an amazing journey that we've been on, but it's a pretty harrowing journey as well. It's a very sad story in a lot of ways, and it really is a bit of a tragedy. It's almost like a sort of a textbook failure of public policy, because people have been kind of talking across each other for a long time without really hearing and collaborating. So there's all sorts of different failures that have led to where we are now. And so Scott and I decided that we'd write a book about it. And what we ended up with is a bit of a blend of different perspectives. And I think that's really important for this space, because you can't just understand water as a scientist or a hydrologist or something, and you can't just understand it from economics or finance or law. You need to bring multiple perspectives and disciplines to it. So what we've ended up with is a book that's a bit of a kind of Michael Lewis or Niall Ferguson finance sort of text, combined with something that's a bit more like current affairs and investigative journalism, and very much written for the general reader. And this is a very, very important point about water, because most of the literature is a bit of an echo chamber, written for people who are insiders. And honestly, the terminology, the complexity, it's, you know, I've been in lots of other spheres of life, including government and the army and academia, and acronym-rich, jargon-rich places, and nothing compared to this. You know, it's its own world. And so what we've tried to do is write a book that's a real entree into this space, that opens it up, looks at it from a different perspective and from multiple perspectives, and actually walks through and really untangles a lot of the complexity. And we've built a bit of a lexicon of key terms that are used and abused in this space. So that's kind of how we got to now. And the book's coming out in a few weeks' time. And so far we've had good responses from some early readers, which is really encouraging.
And tell me, in the journey of water in Australia, has there been a time particular in the history where the idea of water as a limited resource shifted the way governments started to reconsider the scarcity of water?
Yes, there has been. It's a real interesting question, and there's a whole series of different phases for how Australia has thought of water, particularly irrigation water and rural water, and how we've managed the river system. Obviously, Indigenous people had a lot of expertise and science and engineering knowledge, and did some amazing work in shaping the river system. So Budge Bim's a really good example of that, where it's one of the key stone archaeology sites in Australia, as important as any other stone-built archaeology in the world. And it's all about water management and you know, water flow management and aquaculture. And likewise on the Murray, the Darling, the Murrumbidgee, there are stone archaeological works that are about river management and flow management and floodplain management. So there's an incredible history and knowledge there, and a really important current in contemporary water management and governance is about bringing that knowledge to bear and starting to have proper Indigenous voice in those bodies and those decisions. Very early on, there was a bit of a Wild West period in the sort of settlerism period in the 19th century. And I would say most of the 20th century was really about the sort of engineers reigning supreme in water policy, certainly up to the 1990s. And so there was a lot of dam building, particularly at the top of the Murray-Darling catchment. And there was a lot of building of locks and weirs along the rivers. Obviously, these days we think differently about those kinds of works. There's only so many dams you can build, and the dams themselves have all sorts of consequences for the natural properties and flows of the system. Into the 90s and beyond, there were sort of two new major voices in water management. There were the environmental scientists and climate change scientists who've been very important and successful in this space, establishing things like environmental water holders and you know, aspects of the cap and trade system we have, but also economists and finance people coming into this space, sort of late 80s into the 90s and beyond, and bringing ideas from other spheres like energy markets and the financial system and applying them in this space. And I think that particular field and that particular sphere of impact on how water is managed in Australia has probably been the heart of the disaster. I wouldn't, in thinking about how this market has failed, it really wasn't about, it's been a multiple point failure, and it's failed in financial, environmental and social terms. But I wouldn't really point the finger at the engineers or the hydrologists or the environmental scientists. It's really more the market-based policies and the financial policies that have been the key to the failure of the how we manage the system.
Mm.
So yeah, there's been a growth in realisation of how to manage scarcity, and there's a pretty good understanding now that we do have to have dedicated water for the environment, and that flows are likely to fall off even more so than they have already. So all of the stakes are getting higher and higher in how we use this resource, and that has made this research even more urgent, because where we land essentially is that we need to really change in a pretty fundamental way how we manage the river systems, and that has to again bring these different values to bear. It has to bring these Indigenous values to bear. It has to be different from a social point of view, an environmental point of view, and an economic point of view.
And some of the works that both of you have talked about is this bipartisanship of coming together for common causes. Why do you think there is such a problem when it comes to governments coming to a kind of consensus decision about water management and planning?
It's a whole bunch of problems. I think in part I feel a little bit sympathetic for the politicians, because there's so many vested interests in this space and so much complexity. It's pretty easy to scare people away with that cloak of complexity and all the different kinds of rights and all the different imperatives and the different meanings of words like investing and efficiency and sustainability. So there's a real kind of veneer of complexity that keeps outsiders out, and that includes politicians. So that's part of it. Very strong economic vested interests in the space. So some of the larger farmers and larger agribusinesses, some very strong communities, including right downstream. So it's inherently political in every sense, and the way that the modern political administration of Australia is structured doesn't really support consensus or sensible management of the basin, in particular the Murray-Darling Basin, because it straddles 4 states plus a territory, and it's almost built for conflict. So there's a complexity problem, there's the political geography problem, but also the politicians have rightly looked to regulators like the ACCC and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and others to essentially look after the basin, and they've kind of, in some ways, they've tried to delegate the management and regulation of the system and the water market, and they've done that, I think, in good faith, and most of the time, and I think the regulators have taken on that task in good faith. But it's happened in a context where essentially the market design and the regulatory design is fundamentally flawed. The critical steps in the design of this market were never actually taken, and it's the sort of thing that politicians don't really think about. That's not on their radar. They're not sort of thinking about fine-grained technical details around market design. It's just not their responsibility. But the regulators can't design the market either, because they're in the system, not looking on the system. So there's been a series of failures and probably a little bit of finger pointing and a little bit of some key gaps in the system. And so a lot of the failings have been sort of ignored or overlooked or papered over, and there's been a continual sort of series of band-aids and tweaking of the system every year to try and fix the symptoms of what's really a fundamental failure without really thinking about it. And there's big money involved. It's $26 billion of water rights or more, $2 billion of water trading every year, roughly, and a lot more economic value and agricultural production that depends on the basin. So there's so much at stake. There's the rural communities and people's own livelihoods and wealth. There's the environmental costs which are at stake, which are incredible, and there's rivalrous interstate interests. So there's so many things that make this a high stakes game. shrouded by complexity and a bit of wishful thinking. I think when people sort of put the first sort of market systems in place, there was a bit of magical thinking and wishful thinking that sort of the market would sort it out, and that even if it was a bit choppy early on, institutions would develop, and there'd be competitive entry that would take away any kind of supernormal profits in the market. None of that happened, and there's a bunch of reasons why that didn't happen. One was because some of those critical design steps were never taken around market integrity. One is because the market is so fragmented that it's really hard to tell, what the value of water is at any particular moment. And there's this real barrier to entry, which is about knowledge and expertise, and a small number of players have been able to acquire that expertise, and they've just got so much of a jump on everyone else, and they're loving it. They're inside, they're behind the wall of complexity. They're enjoying the volatility and the fragmented nature of the market. And I don't see any kind of trend towards any kind of economic equilibrium or any kind of situation where there's no supernormal profits being earned by traders. I don't see any kind of convergence to something like a fair market or a market with integrity. Far from it. Over time, the market's getting less fair. It's reducing in integrity. The profits from arbitrage trading and other things are increasing, if anything. And some of these traders are looking to America at the moment. High reliability, permanent water entitlements in Australia are selling for things like $8,000. In America, people make the false comparison that those similar rights sell for $28,000 or $30,000, and so they're dreaming of a time here where instead of getting $8,000 for these rights, they'll get $30,000 for these rights. So the tendency is towards more gouging and more dysfunction rather than less. So I hope that's a long answer to a complex question.
And I think it's important that you've really laid that out for everyone to understand that it's not such a cut and dry sort of response, because you have to look at so many years has taken place and so many decisions have allowed certain consequences to happen as a result of actions taken, in predecessor decisions. And I guess before we dive more into the book, I was just thinking of one thing. Do you ever think the way planners have envisaged the way we use water, in terms of the way houses are designed, in terms of, we seem to have lots of sinks, that hold, we're taught to shower endlessly. I mean, we have moved away from baths, yet we still use that product. And that's something that disappointed me in the early 2000s, when we got more and more like stone type, humongous, almost tomb-like baths to be made when water is so scarcity. So does that sort of figure in, or is it because so many industries are built on the use of water that it becomes that other associated industries don't want to give up that? They don't want to go down to the realities of really using water as a scarce commodity, as opposed to, using it as something that people feel they're entitled to?
It's a really good question. So we're getting better as a community around how we use water in general. Like, water efficiency is obviously improved, and you're touching on aspects of urban water use, including in households, and that picture is a lot better than it used to be, with dual flush toilets and shower head efficiency and that kind of thing. And the water market in some sort of ways has helped that, because it's helped put a price on water, or at least signal the value of water. And so in the water industry, rural water authorities are getting much better at how they use water in reusing stormwater, some recycling of recovered water from sewerage. And yeah, we're definitely, as a community, getting better at that. The economics of water are quite specific. It's a unit of water is relatively low, but it's expensive to transport around. Strictly speaking, we do not have a shortage of water, because you can actually turn seawater into drinking water, and you can turn seawater into irrigation water. The problem is not the technology, the problem is the cost. Because if we wanted to have massive, large-scale desalination plants sending water inland, one day we might do that. But we're a long way from that, and that's partly to do with the energy costs associated with that. So all of these questions of water efficiency, water movement, and energy efficiency are connected. In terms of the basin, so we've designed this water market, and one of the things that it's doing is tending to send water rights and water downriver from the traditional agricultural areas around the top of the Murrumbidgee and the top of the Murray, down to arid and semi-arid areas below the Barmah Choke. And some of those very large new farms there of olives and grapes and some other types of tree-grown crops, walnuts and things, almonds, are essentially being grown on irrigated sand. So one of the things that's happened is that the water, in a sense, has moved in a perverse direction. People who started the water market thought that the water would move to where the soils were best, where the local infrastructure was best, where there was supporting infrastructure in local towns and that kind of thing, and where it was closest to markets and that kind of thing. But in some ways, the opposite's happened. And it's happened at a time when, and this is something that was really strongly coming out of our research in talking to rural communities, there's a very strong sense that that movement of water rights to those large industrial farms with novel crops on sand, irrigated on sand in a very precise and probably cheap way, but very precise way, is actually the result of some inherent subsidies in the water system. And the kinds of subsidies that we heard about, there's a hydrological subsidy, which means essentially that the water losses from transporting it from the top of the catchment to the bottom of the catchment aren't reflected in, or aren't adequately reflected in, the water prices paid downstream, downriver. There's an environmental subsidy, because moving water those distances actually causes environmental harm, for example, with bank erosion and other damage in areas like the Millawa Forest and other areas. That's not reflected adequately in the prices downstream and downriver. There's a capital markets subsidy, where the way that people in those mega farms raise money is quite different to the way that people can or can't raise money in family farms. And so there's a view, which I think is very plausible, that there are these inherent biases and subsidies which are essentially favouring certain kinds of agriculture on arid land, the sorts of things that would not be even countenanced in the US, in parts of the US. It would be illegal. So as a community, we've set up this market which is sending water in perverse directions and surprising directions through possibly artifacts of the market itself. And I think people are right in saying that sounds like a pretty strange and risky decision to make. So water efficiency is a really important part of the picture. But thinking about some of these other sorts of quirks and biases in the way that water is used, I think is just as important.
And what about in your investigations? Were you surprised at some of the documents that you were able to find that perhaps that you didn't think you were going to be able to access it, but you were somehow able to uncover?
Yes, I was quite amazed.
Now for the juicy bits.
Well, it's amazing. I mean, it's a really good question. And Scott and I were very privileged to have the access that we got and to hear what we heard and to see what we saw. I think it's the analogy I use is it's a little bit like the energy markets in the 90s and early 2000s, where you had those sort of rogue energy traders,
Oh,
the California fires, and that's saying, cheering on the blackouts and that kind of thing. We heard very similar things in the Murray-Darling Basin from traders, cheering on droughts and just basically laughing as they ripped money out of farmers. Some of them were kind of a bit morally conflicted, and they realised that what they were doing was probably not particularly helpful, but they did it anyway, and they justified that they were doing something which was in their own interests and their sort of their personal and families' economic interests, but not necessarily in the interests of the basin or of basin communities or of farmers. So it was quite amazing. Why do people do that? So what people have said to us privately is quite different to what some people are saying publicly. And I think it's a whole bunch of different reasons why. People like to have their stories heard. People in the basin who've been allowed to do these sort of tactics, I think they see that it is probably a symptom of a larger problem. The whole market was set up essentially as a natural resource management exercise to send water to where it could best be used. So the whole point of the water trading system is essentially about water efficiency, including allocative efficiency. But people inside the market, so exchange managers, traders, brokers, and people on the fringes of the market as well, business people, etc., they can see that fundamentally the market has really deviated from what it was originally supposed to be, and they're in it and they're living it, and they're seeing the amounts of money that are being made. They're seeing the arbitrary transfers of wealth, and it really is quite an amazing moment in these areas. And fundamentally what's happened is that through that market design and through that failure to do basic sort of steps in things like ensuring integrity of brokers, ensuring high quality information, putting some boundaries around market conduct and market manipulation, all those things that didn't happen. The result is that a generation of investment has been taken out of the basin. So, literally over $1 billion has just been taken out. That would have been spent on regional communities and would have been spent on farms, would have been spent on on-farm water efficiency, or on investing in agriculture, investing in our food bowls. Instead, it's gone into the pockets of hedge fund managers and traders. So people inside the system know that that's probably a problem, and they can see the historical importance of the failure and the historical importance of the moment that they're in. So, yeah, surprisingly, they were quite eager to share with us their story. I think also the way Scott and I approached this book and this research was a little bit different to the way a lot of people have approached it. I think people have been talking at each other and across each other for a long time, but not really listening. Even some people from academia who've been looking at this area haven't really been, listening to what farmers and traders and others have been saying, and they haven't brought all of the analytical tools to bear that you need, because this is not, as I said, it's not just a hydrological question, it's not just a legal question, it's not an economic or a public policy thing, it's not just about finance, it's not just about agriculture, it's about all of those things simultaneously, and it's about international accounting and international tax treatment, it's about the superannuation industry and pension funds. I touched on this point of complexity. People talk about, someone investing in water. It can mean 20 different things when someone invests in water. There's a whole bunch of different things it could mean, including buying and trading water rights. It can mean, investing in large scale water intensive agriculture. It can mean investing in water efficiency. So unless we're really precise and we actually separate out different categories of things in this space, then it's going to be fundamentally confused. And I had a conversation with one of the top financial outlets a couple of days ago, and they're saying, oh yeah, there's water traders and they've got these sort of pension fund money and that kind of thing. And I said, no, you're talking about two fundamentally different things. The hedge funds that are coming in and doing day to day and month to month and season to season arbitrage trading, they're a different creature to what people are doing when they put lazy retail pension fund money into a longish term almond plantation. It's a different thing. They're related, and they have a collective impact that helps shape basin agriculture and the impact of this market. But fundamentally, it's different money for different purposes. And unless you actually unpick these things, you just never see the clear picture. So what Scott and I have really tried to do is unpick all the different kinds of tactics and all the different kinds of strategies and behaviours, all the different kinds of players to really allow people to start getting their heads around what fundamentally has happened in this area. And it is, as I said, it's a multi-point failure in regulation, but it's also a multi-point failure in our system of public policy. There should be a kind of error correction mechanism where people on the outside, so auditors, academics, journalists, others, activists, can see these things going wrong, can talk about it, and can actually help fix it. But that error correction mechanism's been really dysfunctional in water, and it's a bunch of reasons why. It's partly because of those vested interests, it's partly because of the complexity and the vocabulary, and it's this whole categorical confusion of different kinds of investment, different kinds of conduct. And I tell you what, behind that fog of confusion, and next to that ineffectual error correction mechanism that isn't correcting any errors, the bankers are laughing all the way to the bank.
I was going to say that. Throughout the book, was there any theme? Does any of the people you spoke to talk about the concept of ownership?
It's a really good question. So there's all sorts of different concepts of ownership that are very relevant here. And one of the things that Scott and I sort of think about is the sort of the geography of ownership. Because obviously that's so important with Indigenous people and Indigenous rights, because the idea of water, it's not separable from the idea of land and community and country and place. It's all one thing, right? And yet the whole idea of commodification of water is about separating that. But also the people who are trading water in an arbitrage sense, like the hedge fund types, they've got no interest in agriculture. They've got a pretend interest in agriculture, but fundamentally they're not interested in agriculture, and they don't really care about the basin or the basin communities, and they might as well be dealing in bets on the World Series or cryptocurrency or Brazilian soybeans. So what they're doing is fundamentally disconnected from the basin and disconnected from place. So yeah, it's very sad. Going back to that point around the sort of international comparison, so people often say this in the basin. Some of the exchange managers and some of the traders, they say, well, water here is $8,000 for these long-term high security entitlements. In Colorado or in California, it's $28,000. And so, well, you're really mixing all sorts of concepts up in thinking about it that way. First of all, the value of water is highly contextual. The value of water depends on what you can do with it. And that depends on soil. It depends on local infrastructure. It depends on the local legal system and the legal rights that are attaching to the water itself. Those things are all different between here and Colorado, first of all. And so to sort of compare the Australian water commodity with an American water commodity is just so wrong-headed. But also internationally traded commodities like gold and Bitcoin and that kind of thing, there is international arbitrage which tends to equalize out value. So gold in Tokyo, if gold in Tokyo slips down below gold in New York, you can buy it in one place and sell it in another place and make a little profit and equal out the prices. In water, and I'm saying this as a message to people in the water space, there is no international arbitrage in water, and there is no international arbitrage in water rights, and there can't be, because you cannot economically transport fresh water from the Murray-Darling Basin to Colorado or vice versa. So these are all sort of, for me, little vignettes of how the way people think about and talk about water and irrigation rights is intrinsically dysfunctional and intrinsically confused, and that linguistic problem is actually an active factor in a public policy failure. Sorry for ranting.
No, it's just, I think a lot of people listening to this will actually really appreciate that really deep level of understanding that so many things that we tend to focus on the local, and we seem to think, oh, if we can do it for one sort of resource, we can do it for another type of resource, and it will be okay in the end of the day. And what you're kind of explaining to it, no, that's not how it works. And yet because of the commodification of water and because of all the different invested interests within that particular natural resource, that it causes a lot of contested needs and interests, and therefore it's never sort of like a level playing field. And I was just thinking about when you were saying that, when you were speaking to Indigenous spokespeople for the area, was there anything that stood out to you that really made you reflect the whole issue, that has really at the core of what perhaps we haven't looked at before, or that you sort of highlights to you, oh my God, this is it, this is why this is so important?
Yeah, no, great question. I think it's actually a really sad story, the way that Indigenous people sort of see the river system and where it's heading. It's actually quite terrible. So there's that point I touched on before about how we haven't made use of, Australia hasn't made use of really good and powerful and scientific Indigenous knowledge about the system. So there's that really important point around how Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge is not reflected in how we're managing this system. And as you touched on, we need to have multiple values brought to bear in how we manage the river system, not just economic and financial values narrowly defined. But one of the major problems with the water system and the way we manage the river system is that essentially over time, and this has led to a lot of some of the algal blooms and the fish kills and that kind of thing, there's a tendency to start thinking of it as a water transport system and as a sort of a system of natural pipes, rather than as a holistic system that needs to be thought of and managed as an ecological system, as an ecosystem. And there are some really sad stories of Indigenous people who've got a long personal history of going down to the river and knowledge and experience, and just saying, look, what they're seeing now is it's a pale imitation of what the river and the rivers used to be like, and it's actually dead water. It's dangerous and it's dead water. And so that's just, as I said, it's a triple bottom line failure in how we've looked after this system. And that for me really brings home that, if for an Indigenous person to say fundamentally that the life has been taken out of this system it's just awful. So that really struck me. There's a sense of optimism that people are starting to, that there's a bit of a turning of the tide, and the ACCC report recently highlighted some of the problems in how the river system's being managed and how the market is working or not working. And I know in some Indigenous communities there is a sense of optimism as well, and that they feel a bit more like they're being listened to. But we've got a long way to go, a very long way to go. And really, the key thing is that Indigenous voice and Indigenous knowledge about the river system, it can't be treated as a marginal add-on or as some sort of like to have. It's got to be central. It's got to be central to how we manage this. And that is fundamentally incompatible with the commodification of water, and fundamentally incompatible with using the water system as a water transport system. And it's incompatible with the current incarnation of the water market. So there's a bit of optimism there, but we've got a long way to go.
And coming to terms with what you have found, what message did you want to let everyone know about the future of this space?
Yeah, we really need to think differently about water. There are things we can keep in the water market. The idea of having having obviously a value set on water and water rights and that kind of thing. Scott and I are not in any sense saying that we want to take anyone's rights away or devalue water. But I think people in the basin from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of different industries and geographies see that it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked from an environmental point of view. It hasn't worked for the communities, and it hasn't worked for agriculture and economic development. So we really need to look again at the market and the way we allocate irrigation water to reflect those different values in a more fundamental way. There are examples and there are tools and methods, and we've outlined some of them in our research. We need to. We're in a closed loop at the moment. We're in a bit of a spinning of wheels in water, and we need to break out of that loop and really start properly talking and listening and thinking differently about how we do this, because it's just so important in a sort of a climate change era, hopefully soon post-COVID era, COVID/post-COVID era, in a time of international change in trade and supply chains, in a time of all sorts of disadvantage and poverty, including growing poverty in the basin. We need to really think differently about it. So I think that's the key message. We need to break out of that loop.
Stuart, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. And Sold Down the River, I know I'm very excited about this publication. Can you maybe let the viewers know how they can get a copy of this pending book that you've now published?
Thanks, Ricky. Yes, so it's coming out officially, I think, on the 31st of August, so in a few weeks' time. It's available for pre-order through text publishing and through most major bookshops and most major book platforms. Hopefully it'll be relatively easy to find either in shops or in libraries. I'm a library person like Ricky, so if you want to borrow it in a library rather than buy it, that's totally good and fine. It'll be out and about. We're planning on doing some events in the regions, including, I think, if I'm giving something away, then keep the secret, but I think we're planning on a launch in Bendigo. And we'll also do events around the place, but obviously that's all, COVID permitting. Fingers crossed in the next few weeks it'll be in bookshops and in libraries and online.
Fantastic. And also look out for this space on the Association of Media Voices, where we will actually look at this as a core text on how we can use that in schools, in high schools, embedding it within the Australian curriculum, and with activities that will really tie into the work that Stuart has undertaken. So thank you so much for your time.
Ricky, it was an absolute pleasure, and thank you for all of your friendship and support over the years as well. It's great to see you.
Thank you.